Our first speaker is Vernon Robbins, and this is the book he's going to be talking about, Destiny of the Republic. And so I will now turn it over to you, Vernon.
Okay, well, here's a real copy of the book, okay? Candace Millard's Destiny of the Republic represents the gripping, tragic, heartbreaking, and presently very relevant story of the election and assassination of our 20th president, James A. Garfield. Garfield served as president for only 6.5 months, from March 4th, 1881, until his death on September 19th, 1881. He was born and raised in Ohio and became a major general in the Union Army during the war between the states, and afterwards he became an Ohio State Senator. He was elected to Congress in 1862, and in 1880 was chosen by delegates on the 36th ballot. The 36th ballot was a long-running thing to run as the Republican candidate for president. He was a highly skilled orator with a firm, moderate approach to civil rights for freedmen. John Philip Sousa was the leader of the band at his inauguration, and Frederick Douglass represented the freedmen at the inauguration ceremony of President Garfield. A key character at the beginning of the book is Charles J. Guiteau, a wild, crazy man who, when he escaped death from a sinking ship, decided he'd been chosen by God to help elect Garfield as president. Later, he decided he had a special duty to assassinate Garfield. So he bought a .44 caliber pistol and shot Garfield at the Baltimore and Potomac Railroad Station in Washington, D.C. On July 2nd, 1881, I'm sorry. Another key character in the book is Dr. Bliss, who was in a position of power to appoint himself as head physician over President Garfield's medical care after Garfield had been shot. Now, Dr. Bliss was one of the American doctors who considered John Lister's scholarly papers on the necessity for antiseptic procedures while caring for wounds and performing surgery to be hogwash. Who was willing to believe that little germs that could not be seen were floating around through the air and getting on surgical tools in people's hands so they would cause infection in people? What a stupid idea, Bliss said, it was to wash surgical tools in carbolic acid or to spray instruments with antiseptic solutions before using them. The .44 caliber bullet that went into Garfield's body on July 2nd, 1881, missed all vital organs and lodged in the fatty tissue underneath the pancreas. Garfield's big, strong, healthy body provided a protective cyst around the bullet, so the bullet didn't cause damage that should have led to Garfield's death. But Dr. Bliss's poking around in the wound, first with his finger and then with a long instrument without using any antiseptic procedures, caused horrible infection in the wound. During the second week of Garfield's illness, Dr. Bliss announced to the nation, against the advice of other physicians, that Garfield was such a healthy man that within a couple of weeks he'd be returning to his desk at his presidential office to pick up his full presidential duties. As the infection spread throughout Garfield's body, Dr. Bliss continued against all odds to insist that within just another week or two, the president would surprise everyone with a healthy recovery. This continued for 2.5 months, from July to September, while President Garfield's body was valiantly fighting the sepsis Dr. Bliss had caused within Garfield's body. Garfield died on September 19th, 1881, to the shock of people across the nation. Another dramatic part of the story focuses on Alexander Graham Bell, who worked day and night during July, August, and September to perfect an electrical metal detector instrument that would make a noise when a wand was moved over the president's body and indicate where the lead bullet had lodged. The problem was that Dr. Bliss would not let Alexander Graham Bell move the wand over the left side of Garfield's body because he was certain that the bullet was on the right side. If he would have let Bell move the wand over the left side of the body, he would have actually found the location of the bullet. It wouldn't have done any good anyway. I decided to start this book with an hour of reading one day. After 3.5 hours of reading, I realized I was a third of the way through the book and it was late afternoon. The second setting with the book was not pleasant as the infection was spreading through Garfield's body, and we were getting reports of the spread of the coronavirus from Wuhan, China, to other parts of the world. I finished the book on the third setting, haunted by how difficult it was to read many of the tragic pages of the book, but energized by the remarkable information and hard work by many people in a context of extreme adversity. I was utterly amazed at how relevant this book is for what we are experiencing right now on a daily basis. I was deeply impressed by the remarkable detective work of Candace Millard in Garfield's papers and other archives, and I was deeply grateful for her wonderful writing skills. I highly recommend Destiny of the Republic, A Tale of Madness, Medicine, and the Murder of a President by Candace Millard. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Vernon. Are there any questions or comments? If so, just raise your hand. And
I don't see any hands raised.
Let's see, I did see a hand.
Did you? I don't see any.
Yeah. Okay, I don't see any. Oh, Rudy.
Oh, there's Rudy. Oh, Gretchen also has her hand up.
Right. I think I unmuted Rudy. Rudy, I thought I unmuted.
Oh yeah. I think now the red thing is gone.
Right.
So can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Well, how did he feel during this thing? I mean, you were just describing what's happening inside his body. Was he feeling sick or bad? I mean,
he was feeling horrible. He was in horrible pain.
Yeah. But you talked about the internal things going on, but he felt it too. I mean, it's not. So it was obvious that he was getting worse.
Yes. President Garfield was in horrible pain every day, and they kept giving him various kinds of things, including finally some morphine to try to help. But he was obviously suffering very, very badly. And many of the physicians who could get in and see him were just horrified. But Dr. Bliss just kept insisting, well, he's going to come through this. He's going to come through this.
Okay, Gretchen has her hand raised.
Thank you so much. You just gave me a wonderful idea for my brother-in-law's birthday. I'm going to get him this book. He loves to read about American history, and this sounds terrific. Also, that was just so well done. I hope you will, and the others of you too, consider sending along a description of the sort you've just offered for the next newsletter, so we can share the recommendation with everyone who isn't here today. Thanks.
Welcome. Oh, the middle part, who is it? You're going to give it to your brother? There are some very, very difficult parts of the book, as I indicated, and when you're describing the infection, very vividly, graphically describing the pus. It's very difficult, and I thought, golly, can I read this? But I just kept going, and overall, it was an amazing experience.
Okay, thank you, Vernon. And our next speaker is Holly York. And Holly will be talking about David McCullough, The Greater Journey.
I'm unmuted. I'm able to speak now? Yes?
Yes.
Hello? You can't hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, all right. One of the things that made me think about this book while I read it a while ago was it's The Greater Journey, Americans in Paris. And I'd kind of hoped to be an American for a while in Paris in a few months, but that's apparently not going to happen. And full disclosure, I read it when it first came out about 10 years ago and then have come back to it recently. And when I did read it the first time, the way I discovered it was that it came through on my, my Audible feed. I'm a big fan of Audible because I like to listen to books while I'm doing tasks that really don't require much attention. And I was fascinated by this book. It describes trips to Paris by Americans who are illustrious for a number of different reasons between about 1830 to almost to the turn of the century. And they went for various reasons, all of them very serious reasons. Some of the people are household names, some of them not. Some of the names that you would hear on here were James Fenimore Cooper, who at the time, around the early 19th century, was the most famous novelist, most famous American novelist. Oliver Wendell Holmes, and I have to say to myself, not that Oliver Wendell Holmes, because he's the father of the 20th century Supreme Court justice, and he was a poet first, and some may know his poetry, and then a physician, an excellent physician. Another name was Samuel F.B. Morse, whom I knew in the context of the Morse code, not realizing that he really was a very successful painter who's a portrait artist and very, very serious artist. Elizabeth Blackwell, who was the first American woman physician, and Charles Sumner, whom I was interested to meet. He was an abolitionist at the time, a famous abolitionist who became particularly known for having been beaten almost to death on the floor of the Senate by a representative. He was a senator and had given a speech on abolishing slavery, and one of the Southern representatives came over and almost killed him on the floor of the Senate, and he was still quite disabled for the rest of his life. And there are many others, but McCullough weaves these stories in together so well and they're so engaging, and at the same time scholarly. He has quite, at the end of the book, he gives all the full references to letters and journals that these people wrote, as well as footnoting. It's all annotated. But at the same time, it's a very engaging tale. I was fascinated to really be reminded of what a big thing it was to go to cross the Atlantic in the early 19th century when they were still doing sailing ships. There at the time even early on, had been some steamboats that were on the rivers, on the Mississippi River in the US, but they didn't yet have steamships that were ocean going. So they were all sailing ships, and it took about a month, maybe as many as 6 weeks, if they made it. And many of them didn't. Many times, of course, these people all made it, but there were plenty of examples of ships that did not make it and were never heard from again. And they were not primarily passenger ships. They didn't have those yet. They had what were called packet boats that were cargo ships that did have room for passengers, and passengers were served on them. The reasons for going, particularly, there are several artists and in the fields of art and medicine, where Paris was particularly well known and respected. In medicine, France much different from the United States in their medical education, required a college degree before you could go to medical school. Otherwise, it was open to anyone who had a college degree, which was a certain sort of limitation on its own. In the US, a college degree was not required at the time. In fact, many doctors would shadow. This is the early 19th century. Many doctors would be shadowing an older doctor and then maybe taking over his practice afterwards. And so many of these there were young men in this group of people that were followed by McCullough. Many of them were going over for medicine, and we got to see some of the reasons why in the book. If you read the book, you'll see some of the reasons why. One interesting reason was that they were much more inclined to use cadavers in their medical teaching, which in the US didn't come until later because of ethical considerations. People thought it was profaning the human body. And in France, people were regularly committing suicide by jumping into the Seine, and they just put a big screen there and caught those bodies and then would put them, hold them for a few days in case they were collected by anyone. Most of the time they weren't, and then they were fair game for the medical school. Also, French women were much more open to being examined than American women were. It was seen sometimes as unseemly, and so the care for women was quite more advanced in France than it was in the US. So that was in terms of medicine. And then in terms of art, that was also, Paris was also seen to be the place where artists should go because of the museum in the Louvre. The collection in the Louvre was tremendous, and a large amount of their art training was often in copying. And that was one of the ways that they worked, that their training worked. Let me see some other things. Oh, I wanted to make a comment about the fact that I so much enjoyed the Audible volume when I listened to it, and I did buy the book as well because I had to go back to it. The thing about it, for Audible fans, it's narrated both by McCullough and also by, what's his name, Herman. Let's see. He's the narrator. I just misplaced his name, but he's a narrator that you would recognize, Edward Herman. His voice quality is similar to McCullough's voice quality, but Herman also you would recognize from a lot of Ken Burns specials that he has narrated in the past. And I've taken to, again, listening to this. I'll put this book on the Audible instead of listening to the radio because I'm trying to stay away from news a little bit. And this is a voice, a much more comforting voice to listen to than the news if you're trying to stay away from that while you're doing other activities.
Another minute or two, Holly.
I think I'll stop there in case there are any questions there. The thing that was really fascinating about this was there was so much information and so many characters, but they came to life and they were interwoven. You would check back with another character and he'd say, and then meanwhile, this character visited Lafayette. Several of the characters wanted to visit Lafayette because he was a great American hero who had visited the United States, and he was the last of the revolutionary heroes and was very happy to welcome Americans to his chateau, I guess, in Paris. And so that was something I really enjoyed, the interweaving of characters that just made it constantly fascinating.
Does anyone have a question or comment? If so, just click on raise your hand and aha. Gretchen.
Hi, Holly, I'm wondering what sense does the book give you about life in France itself and about life in Paris during that period?
Well, it was mostly, so these were people, they're mostly, in the educated group, so in the sort of high society, not high society, but mid to high society, if they're hanging out with Lafayette, some of these people. Of course, this was right after the 1830 revolution, and it was also right after, after the period of the cholera epidemics that were going on. But for the most part, it was the Paris life that some of the parents of these young men worried about, that it was quite a gay old time. They were having a pretty good time in Paris. And an interesting thing was when a lot of the people landed in France, they were so astounded that people were speaking French. They had never heard another language spoken on the street before. And the fact that they were speaking French was amazing. And they were amazed at the food. They loved the food. They loved the fashion. Both the men and the women loved the fashion and kind of changed their style when they were there. So this was certainly a privileged group that were there.
And
Amazing that even the little kids could speak French, right?
Right. They're amazing. I remember being amazed at the same thing. I thought, wow.
and Catherine Mitchell has her hand raised.
I just, could you repeat the title? I'm sorry.
It's The Greater Journey.
The Greater Journey.
And
Great.
it's David McCullough.
Okay, great. Thank you so much.
Any other questions? Oh, Gretchen has her hand raised again.
I'm irrepressible. No, I just wanted to say again that we will list all of the books and authors and some information about each in the next edition of the newsletter too.
Okay, so I think we need to move on, and so Marianne Skeen is our next presenter, and she is talking about old filth. So Marianne, we'll turn it over to you.
You got me.
Okay, am I turned over? I don't, I see Holly, but there we go. Okay, hi everybody. I want to talk about this book, which I think has a fascinating title. It's one that we did in our book club not long ago, and it introduced me to an author that I was totally unfamiliar with, as are most Americans. Jane Gardam is the author. She was actually born in 1928. She's British. She's written a lot of books, gotten a lot of literary awards in the UK, but it's not really well known in the United States. This book's actually the first in a trilogy, and it's kind of interesting that even the libraries here don't have much. The Emory Library has all 3 books in the trilogy. The DeKalb County Library only has 1 copy of Old Filth. Old Filth was published in 2004, which means that Jane Gardam was 76 at the time. The second, and it's told from the standpoint of the husband in this saga. It is a novel. The second one is The Man in the Wooden Hat, which is told from the viewpoint of the wife, and I've read it, and actually I even like it a little bit better, and it fills in some interesting blanks and some interesting perspectives from a much different viewpoint. And the third one, which I haven't read, is told from the viewpoint of a third character in the book who's very important. And it was actually published in 2013 when Jane Gardam was 85 years old. So that sort of goes to our theme for chef lectures as creativity in retirement years. She obviously hasn't retired, but I really enjoyed the book. It introduced me to someone new and someone I think more Americans would like if we knew about her. So I thought I'd pass her along to you all. I liked it because it has a really, first of all, it's historic. So I learned some things about, and I'll go into more of that later, but it also has a really nice balance between poignancy and some things that just make your heart break for this man who is the main character, Old Filth. And then also some really funny parts. And she's just a very skillful writer, I think, and very well, I really enjoyed her writing. It's dedicated to the Raj orphans. And Old Filth is a Raj orphan, and what I learned about that, I wasn't really aware that much of this group of people, but basically the book starts right after World War I, so it goes through a big part of the 20th century. So you get a lot of history in this too. But and that was the time of the big time of the British Empire. And so a lot of the diplomats, the functionaries in the empire, in the Raj, ended up sending their children back to Britain at very early ages. And so they were separated from their parents, and it resulted in a lot of emotional distancing in these people. Maybe not all of them, but certainly in this character. And so Old Filth was, his mother died 3 days after he was born. His father was still in what they then called shell shock from World War I, and just couldn't even deal with this child at all. And so he kind of turned the child over to a wet nurse. He was born in Malaysia. The wet nurse loved him, and he was having a perfectly lovely childhood, running around with all the little Malaysian kids and having a blast, and feeling lots of love there. But it was considered just not right for British children to be raised in Asia at the time. And so, in fact, a missionary came to him and said, well, you have to send this child back to England. And so she took him back at age about 5 years old, something like that, very young. Of course, he had no relationship to his father, was taken away from all his Malaysian playmates and put with a really abusive foster family in Wales, and some really painful things there. And then he was sent off to boarding schools, and various and sundry things happened there. So he has a whole series of losses in his life. But he's very bright, goes to school, gets a law degree, becomes a lawyer. And filth, the title Old Filth comes from the acronym Failed in London, Try Hong Kong. And so he's really attached to Asia. He goes back to Asia with this sort of strange character who is a kind of a shyster who helps him set up a very lucrative law practice in Hong Kong. He's not really set up to be in the Temple Bar Society of Britain because he doesn't have the really, the whatever to join in that society, but he loves Hong Kong. And then he meets, after a series of losses in his life, he meets Betty, whom he marries, and she becomes the rock of his life. And so there's a lot of that in there, but a lot of things about marriage, loss, how to try to deal with a marriage after having all these emotional losses. And he says to her, just promise me you'll never leave me. And so they develop quite a society thing in the expat community of Hong Kong, and the book doesn't go into that much. The book actually opens when he and Betty have come back to Dorset in Britain and retired and are living the country life, and he starts really reflecting on these various pieces of his life. So Gardam goes back and forth in time, but very skillfully. To me, it wasn't, disconcerting, but he looks back on these various things of his life and the poignancy of the losses. But then there's just a really funny section from the World War II era when, after a bunch of mishaps, he doesn't get sent off to fight as he wants, but he's assigned to guard one of the guards of the Queen when she's evacuated to the seacoast out of London, and she develops a liking for him, and there's just some really amusing scenes in there. So I just think it would be fun. I think a lot of people would enjoy it, and I think she's an author that more Americans would enjoy reading, and I think I'll stop there.
Great, thank you, Marianne. Are there questions or comments from anybody? Just click on raise your hand. While you're thinking about that, I'll just make a comment. You've probably noticed this wonderful setting that Marianne is sitting in and how delightful it is. And that is illustrating one of these advanced features of Zoom, that if one goes to that caret by your camera, you can choose a virtual background. What you can do depends on your camera and so forth. My laptop won't let me do anything unless I have a green screen behind me, but any of you who are sort of intrigued by that, you can actually choose any picture. If it's not available on Zoom, you can upload it. But are there any questions or comments? I don't see any hands. Any hands? Okay. Then our next presenter is Clark Lemons, and he is talking about the women in the castle. So, oops.
Okay, I'm on, right?
Yes.
Women in the Castle. Here's the book. You probably can't tell anything about this book because I always take the covers off when I'm reading a book to save them, the jackets, and then I lose them. I looked for it for a while today. It'll turn up. So published in 2017 by HarperCollins, Jessica Shattuck's historical fiction, the fiction is based on a meticulous lot of research. The novel takes place in 1945, in 1939, and in 1991, and it's not chronological, typical of many contemporary novels and other novels as well. It's some might not like the switchbacks from one time to another and from one character's viewpoint to another's. I liked it because it was a very gradual but intense build, and there was never a lack of continuity, in my opinion. The women are 3 women whose husbands were executed for their involvement in the plot to kill Hitler in July of 1944. The characters, husbands, wives, minor characters, are fictional. The plot against Hitler, of course, was not, nor are the circumstances of wartime and post-war Germany, which are detailed after much research and well done, I think. Then the castle. The castle is a rundown, almost uninhabitable Bavarian mansion that the main character, Marianne, inherits from her husband, one of the people who plotted against Hitler's life in that event. Both of them were aristocrats, liberal Germans, and they despised Hitler from the very beginning. We don't know about the other 2 women. There are 3 women until later in the book. Other characters besides the 3 women, lovers, neighbors, children of the women, Nazis, appear, so you do have to keep track of the names. Marianne is a principled woman. We see her as the instigator of action and the center of the novel. She's not very likable, but neither are most of the characters. How many people we do admire are what we call likable? Anyway, they are all flawed and in completely understandable ways, as are most of us. This is the reason I like the novel so much. All the characters are Germans. All are significantly and humanly affected by the war and the aftermath. There aren't heroes or heroines, just people trying to be faithful and conscientious to something, trying to make it in, to say the least, a very difficult time, trying to understand what is going on, and finally trying to come to grips at the end of the war to what has gone on. A character at the end of the story after the war answers a question about her support of Nazis at the time. She says, "Forgiveness? God forbid. I would never ask for that." There's some gruesome passages in the novel, but these don't take precedence. What does is the way characters of different politics and class continue relationships in spite of what's happened. What takes precedence is how people survive day to day and how day-to-day relationships become established and then even permanent and valuable. At the center of the novel is a question about degrees of responsibility for how war, oppression, persecution come about and one's responsibility. The prose is spare and metaphorical. The insights thought-provoking. One line I liked especially, quote, "She half knew, but there's no word for that. She knew it the way you know something is happening far away in a distant land, something you have no control over, such as earthquake refugees living in squalid conditions or victims of foreign war." Shattuck's novel, her third, was inspired by an interview more than 20 years ago with her grandmother, whom she loved, an avid Nazi in the 30s and 40s, who lived to be 100 years old. Not a depressing novel if you want to accept the reality you know, but rather an uplifting one, I think, if you like novels whose characters believably respond in their own way to the world of their times. Thank you.
Okay, are there comments or questions? Just click on raise your hand. Oops. Aha, I saw Vernon.
Yeah, Clark, very interesting. Oh, as you see, I've decided to go out to San Francisco to see the Golden Gate Bridge there. Actually, I'm still here in Atlanta, but that's okay. I just wanted to follow Marianne's inspiration there a little bit. Clark, is there description of what the women actually do and what they tried to plan and how it did not go well or something like that?
The plot was the women are the widows of the people involved in the plot to kill Hitler. And that we never really see. There are some names, historically accurate names of people who did participate, but they really aren't characters in the book. The women, the main character, Marianne, is very wealthy, but toward the end, she doesn't have anything to eat and doesn't have shoes to wear with her magnificent wardrobe of dresses and hats.
No.
Other characters, the women aren't really employed. They're married to these heroes who died. They all have to respond in their own ways to that. And then the three of them all come together at Marianne's ruined castle and interact and become attached and have fights, and that's what the story is about.
I was wondering at the time about, I know nothing about Dietrich Bonhoeffer's family, you know, and what they were going through when he was accused of making a plot and then put in prison.
In prison for a very long time. His family actually was quite a upper middle class, wealthy, you know, successful family, many members, and there are many letters, as you know, from his prison.
Yeah. So in the what the book describes might be kind of a thing that we might think about is going on in Dietrich Bonhoeffer's home with the widow or family there.
Right. The novel really focuses on three different periods: 1939, when Hitler is really on the rampage, but before the war, and then 1945 at the very end of the war. And his family, Bonhoeffer's family, would have felt the lack of supplies and food and any kind of heat or so forth. And I did not realize how long that went after the war ended. And of course, the basic invasion of the Russians made it very difficult for German people, and both sides hated each other.
So these women's husbands had already been killed, or you described them as widows.
July of 44. If they were real people, that's when they would have died. That was the plot.
Okay.
And Linda Hubert has her hand up.
Yes, I'd just like to know a little bit more about the author, Clark. I don't know a thing that isn't me. I don't know.
Yeah, sorry, Linda, here, there.
It's okay. I don't know anything about this author, and I missed the first name you gave it.
Jessica Shattuck. Shattuck. And if I had the actual dust cover, I could probably tell you something about her, but I don't really know. It's interesting. She's from German heritage, and went to Germany many times to visit family. Her grandmother was alive and a mature woman during World War II, and she loved her grandmother and visited her at her home and got to know her. And then wisely interviewed her at length before she died. And she became sort of a model for some of the characters. She's written 2 other books, and I think I'd like to read them. I haven't.
Okay, and one last question from Tiny, and she was the one I would. There you are.
Here,
There you are again.
here's a book, by the way.
That's it.
Yes. It comes up looking, yeah, Women in the Castle.
Have you read it?
Yes.
Did you like it?
Not so very much. I tell you, the author is very young to write this novel, but that's okay. But there were things that seemed to me contrived very much by putting them all in this one book.
Right.
For example, one of the 3 women, having survived the Dresden thing on their way back, seemed a bit put in there. Plus the fact that woman, of course, had faked her identity, so she was not really a widow of one of the people, of one who had been involved in the assassination. Actually, what I liked the most was the main character, Marianne, all the way through to starting a foundation at the end for peace. But she was very consistent in wanting to maintain the, or feeling the responsibility of keeping the sacrifice for trying to save the nation alive. And she's found that to be an enormous responsibility in the way she lived and in the way she saved a lot of others, children and all. And so even though you said she wasn't very sympathetic, I think she was a very consistent character. And that's what I liked. I like that maybe best about the novel.
Yeah, I did too. Admirable person, but
she wasn't charming. She wasn't an easy person, but she never gave up in a way that the other women weren't anywhere near quite as strong as she was in holding on. And it was her responsibility to her class, if you will, and certainly to the memory of her husband and the husband of one of the other women whom she loved.
She loved too, yes.
Yeah. So,
anyway.
Okay, we're going to have to move on. The next is Lee Pasackow, who is going to be talking about the education of an idealist. Okay.
I'm waiting to see myself.
Okay. Yep. Oh, there we go. Okay.
Okay. Hello, everybody. You may remember that Samantha Powers was Obama's ambassador to the UN. As Tom Friedman said in his book review in the New York Times, she believed in using American power to protect innocent civilians and advance democracy. He states that this book is a combination of autobiography, diplomatic history, and moral arguments. I think Power is a terrific and insightful writer. I also recommend her book, Chasing the Flame, One Man's Fight to Save the World, about Sergio Vieira de Mello. He was the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. Kofi Annan asked him on a temporary basis to be his special representative in Iraq. He was killed in an explosion 3 months after he arrived in 2003. So Power struggled with an alcoholic father growing up in Ireland. She was brought by her mother to the US in 1979, and she actually studied in Lakeside High School. She started out as a sports writer, then transitioned to a war correspondent covering the Bosnian War. After that experience, she attended Harvard Law School and wrote her 2003 Pulitzer Prize winning book, A Problem from Hell, America and the Age of Genocide. As Chris Harmer in the London School of Economics blog wrote, Power had advocated a range of policy options between inaction in the face of mass atrocities and all-out boots-on-the-ground military intervention. Her book on the genocide was brought to the attention of then-Senator Obama. She was Obama's human rights advisor. She also served as director for multilateral affairs in the National Security Council. In 2013, she was sworn in as the youngest US ambassador. 3 weeks into her appointment, there was the chemical attack by Assad in Syria. Excuse me. She advocated for US intervention in Syria. Obama put the plans into place, and only at the last minute, he decided to ask for congressional approval. She considered resigning over Obama's refusal to act in Syria. But in the end, quoting Obama, better is good. Perfect is rarely on the menu. In Libya, Obama followed her advice and others to intervene, but with no follow-up strategy, the country dissolved into chaos. Despite failures, Power served in an administration that also did much to promote human rights. Thousands of Iraqi Yazidis who fled ISIS in 2014 were provided safe passage following US airstrikes that Power and others advocated. She helped persuade the UN Security Council to define the Ebola epidemic as a threat to international peace and security, energizing the mobilization of a multinational response, including the deployment of US troops. So think where we would be today if we had more people like Powers advising the administration. Powers' pioneering work in promoting LGBT rights at the UN encouraged the first ever Security Council condemnation of attacks on the basis of sexual orientation. Some say she was a bit too sanctimonious. Obama could make the remark in a meeting saying, yeah, Samantha, we all read your genocide book. But when she was quiet in meetings, he would pause and ask for her opinion. She is a caring human being, a mother trying to live by a moral compass, and it didn't always work out. She made an effort to visit every UN mission in New York City, not inviting the representatives to come to the big US headquarters, but rather going to their offices. She invited all the women ambassadors to her residence to watch the returns of the elections in 2016. Obviously, they were pretty disappointed. I thoroughly enjoyed this book and think that it's highly relevant today as we read about the decision-making processes in our government. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Lee. And I see one hand raised. Tiny.
Oh, yeah, well, I had actually, but maybe it reminded me the previous book is also relevant in as much as it shows, as you're saying, it shows the way into a chaotic dictatorship. And that's something that we're often not aware of. How did it get there? That was for Germany. And so if we're thinking about this book being relevant today, it is again looking how genocide is how the road for genocide is often, full of good advice and hurdles that's not heard.
Okay, and Linda Hubert.
I just wanted to note that this book has been selected as the Phi Beta Kappa Book Award book for this year. That means that some 50 high school students are getting this book. And as a consequence, she was invited to come to Atlanta as the distinguished lecturer, and unfortunately could not schedule it because she was going to be out of the country. Maybe she won't be, and we'll have to revisit this. But any of you all who are interested at all in Phi Beta Kappa programs should check into the Metro Atlanta PBK Association. And that would be a good thing to do, whether you're actually a Phi Beta Kappa person or not. All kinds of guests are welcome. Thanks.
Where was she going to be speaking?
Well, that she has come and spoken at the Carter Center. We had not arranged the venue because we normally have this in connection with a big reception for all the winners of the book award, and that's been going on at one of the local clubs, frankly, and this was not yet determined, but the conflict made it moot. So.
Interesting.
Any other questions? Okay. If not, our next speaker, presenter is Jan Pratt, and she is going to be talking about rules for visiting. So let's get Jan set up here. Okay. There.
Unmute. Okay. Let's unmute myself. Okay. Okay, so the book I'm talking about is called Rules for Visiting. It's a novel. It was published in 2019. I don't read a lot of fiction, so I'd never read this author before. But I see from her dust cover that she had written 3 or 4 other books and various articles and things. Her name is Jessica Frances Cain. Anyway, this book is about friendship. And on the dust cover, or not on the dust cover, but on the front part, she has a quote from Virginia Woolf, which I thought was worth reading. It's from her book, her poems, The Waves. I'm not familiar with it. It says that I visited each of my friends in turn, trying with fumbling fingers to prise open their locked caskets. I went from one to another, building my sorrow. No, not my sorrow, but the incomprehensible nature of this our life for their inspection. Some people go to priests, others to poetry, I to my friends. And I think that really sums up this book really well. The main character is a woman called May Attaway. She works as a university gardener. She lives with her father, who's a retired professor from the same university. They are very routinized people. They stick to the same routine day in, day out. They're not social people. They don't have friends come in. They don't go to visit friends. May looks at her neighbors, observes what they're doing, but she doesn't want to participate, doesn't want to get to know them. And then suddenly, through circumstances which are described in the book, she gets leave from her job, and she decides that what she wants to do with her leave is to visit these 4 old friends she had years and years ago at different times in her life, from different periods in her life. And they were all very close, but she hasn't really stayed in touch with them. So she decides that what she's going to do is visit them. And she's going to visit them in turn, because 3 of them are in the US and 1 is in Britain. She thinks about the rules for being a host and a guest, and she says, and I like this quote, being a good guest requires knowing how to let yourself be welcomed. She has absolutely no experience with that. She then reads Emily Post, and she quotes Emily as saying, she has pages and pages on directions for hosts, but for a guest, she writes only, quote, the perfect guest not only tries to wear becoming clothes, but tries to put on an equally becoming attitude. So she's very classically trained, and so she thinks that this is an odyssey. As somebody said, if Penelope had left. So she buys a suitcase, she calls it Grendel, refers to it as Grendel throughout, and sets off for the airport. So each friend she visits and they welcome her. They're all in different positions in their life. They're married, they're divorced, they have children, they don't have children. So every interaction is different because the circumstances of the people are different and they've changed. By the end of all her journeying, May finds that she herself has changed. It's really a lovely book. It's very witty, very introspective as May visits with these folks. But it's really about friendship and what makes a friendship last, even if it's lasting over years or time and space, even when you don't see each other very often. I have friends that I consider close friends from my childhood and my university days in England. And I never see them but about once a year. But I would always say they were close friends. So what makes that friendship endure is really what she's exploring. Also, as a bonus for gardeners, there's lots and lots of references to trees and shrubs and things, very beautifully described. So I recommend this book. It's not a heavy book. It's not an exploration of historical fiction or facts or whatever, but it's a really nice book just to read. And since I think I probably have another minute, I want to refer also to a very different book, Just Mercy, written by Brian Stevenson. Some of you, I think, have probably seen the movie. That focuses on just one of his cases, but the book, Just Mercy, covers his whole career. And it is a sobering indictment of the American judicial system, I have to say. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Jan. Any questions, comments? Just click on raise your hand and Lee.
So Jan, maybe you know or knew, and many others, that Brian Stevenson was going to be the commencement speaker.
I did, and I was hoping to hear him. I have met Brian. Back in my earlier life, when I was working at Emory and interacting with a lot more people in the profession, I met Brian. So he's a very impressive guy.
Yes, he did come, not too long ago with Ray Hinton, and they spoke. But hopefully, Emory will have him again.
Yeah, and I do recommend the movie if anybody.
Yeah, it was good.
See the movie. This book's not a movie book. This is a sitting in your hammock, under your trees, isolated, and want to get absorbed in a nice book. This is that book, Rules for Visiting.
Gretchen.
Yeah, hey, a couple of things. I just wanted to say, as far as commencement day, commencement program now canceled, but we've had Gary Hawk step forward and volunteer to speak to us on that Monday about the history of commencements at Emory. So no Brian Stevenson, but not bad. So we're delighted with that. And I just also wanted to say, I expect I'm not the only one. Well, first, as age advances, thinking more and more about getting in touch with very old friends that I've been out of touch with, and especially in these last several weeks. I expect it's been happening to a lot of you, voices from the past that have spoken to me, usually over email. And I too, I wrote a note to a woman I lived next door to at Wellesley sophomore year, and somehow I befriended her, or she befriended me. I've ignored her these 60 years. But anyway, I wrote her a note the other day because she sent a wonderful photograph of lilacs. She lives up north and had brought in some lilacs. And I told her how wonderful spring is down here, except for the lack of lilacs.
And so actually, this does kind of make this book relevant in the sense that I too have been hearing from people that I don't normally hear from, and reaching out to people that I haven't been in touch with. So it is kind of relevant to that, I think, in our cloistered state.
Okay. Thank you, Jan. And so Gretchen, do you want to go with your book then? Gretchen is going to talk about Hilary Mantel, The Mirror and the Light. Mm-hmm, yeah.
Might do with the little bit of time we have left is let Vernon go ahead with his second book. But I did want to mention The Mirror and the Light. I did not realize until 2 days ago that this had come out. And like many people, I've been waiting 8 years for it. You may be among those who have. It's the third volume of the trilogy about Thomas Cromwell and the time of Henry VIII. And by Hilary Mantel. The first two volumes both won Booker Prizes, and this one is apparently winning accolades as well. So if you're a great fan of Wolf Hall and Bring Up the Bodies, the first two books, this came out on March 10th, and it now resides on my Kindle. But let Vernon say a little bit about the second book, where he too was dealing with a character, a novel in this case, who came through terrible times, the Russian Revolution, and how it traces what happened to him.
Okay, and I'm showing then this second book of Vernon. And so Vernon, if you want to say a few words about this book.
Okay. That's interesting. The background doesn't let me do this. Okay. This book, A Gentleman in Moscow, is very, very different from the other book that I just talked about. When describing the language in this book, I wrote, "Language soars like an eagle from page to page." It is truly delightful to read. It's historical fiction. It begins in the Russian Revolution in the context of World War I. Count Alexander Ilyich Rostov is sentenced to house arrest on the 6th floor of the Metropole Hotel located in Theater Square in Moscow. Okay. His crime was writing and publishing a 19-line poem in 1913, which is at the front of the book, entitled, "Where Is It Now?" that a jury of leaders now think truly contains revolutionary implications. So he's sentenced to life imprisonment in the hotel under house arrest, rather than shooting him in the town square. Okay, so you sense the delightfulness of this writer. He's put under house arrest rather than shot because of the wealth and status of his family, signified by his title, which is Count Alexander Ilyich Rostov, recipient of the Order of St. Andrew, member of the Jockey Club, master of the hunt. So on the 21st of June, 1922, Count Rostov was taken to the Metropole Hotel and moved from his palatial suite where he lived on the 3rd floor to a small room on the 6th floor. He's able to expand the size of his living quarters by smashing through the back wall into a small room behind it that no one knows about because he's way up at the top of the hotel. So he hangs a curtain over the hole in the wall, and he is able to part the curtain and walk back through that hole into this little room that now functions nicely as a little study where he can read and write. And it's a very comfortable little place. As the story unfolds over 3 decades, from 1922 to 1954, Count Alexander Rostov first develops a charming relationship with a 9-year-old girl named Nina. This young girl, who is left there in the hotel, or she's visiting there with her, an overseer, a guardian. He talks with Nina, this 9-year-old girl, and this young girl takes him around and shows him special stairways and hiding places in the hotel that she has found while she was just going around, including the basement, which becomes important as the story moves forward. Now, when Nina goes away, gets married, she has a child named Sophia. And Nina brings her child back at, 9 years later, and suddenly tells Count Rostov that she must leave Sophia with him for a short while she's going to go away. Well, Count Rostov, living in this hotel now, however, becomes a stepfather now to a 5-year-old girl. When Nina leaves her there in his custody, and she thinks it's just for a short time, but Nina is taken off to a work camp in Siberia and is never able to return for her darling little Sophia. So Count Rostov becomes, in effect, her stepfather, who must raise her from age 5 on up. Now, another part of the story is Count Rostov's love affair with a well-known actress and movie star, Anna Urbanova, who has a luxurious suite in the hotel like Count Rostov used to have. Now, Anna is able to help Count Rostov with important connections for nurturing young Sophia's brilliant skill on the piano into musical competitions and recitals in multiple venues, including finally in Paris, France, because Anna Urbanova, as a movie star and an actress, has all kinds of connections in the artistic world for performance of music, etc. Now, important events occur in the barbershop in the Metropole Hotel, where Count Rostov has a weekly appointment with Yaroslav Yaroslavy, the barber of Metropole Hotel, who is without peer anywhere else in Moscow. Okay. Now, many things also happen in the lobby as people from various countries gather or come to the desk, and then they're taken to the room. People from Sweden or Denmark or various United States even, and various other places. Now, of the 2 restaurants in the Metropole, the Boyarsky, which is the finest restaurant in Moscow, provides not only the most excellent choices of cuisine and beverage for Count Rostov, but also some of his most cherished male comradeship. So instead of enjoying plants and animals, or plants and gardens, here with this book, you can enjoy some excellent cuisine and some of the finest beverages, wines and also brandies, and learn the year, etc. Which, in fact, but at one point, all the wine in the basement now, all the labels are taken off of them by the new revolutionary leaders to equalize everyone's drinking of wine. Okay, so now the wine steward in restaurant Boyarsky has a problem when he goes down, because he will have a particular order of the year, etc. But there's no label on any of the bottles. So a person who may think they're getting some ordinary wine may be getting a special vintage that would cost a lot of money. Anyway, one of the most delightful of the books, parts of the books, is Amor Towles' choice of names, words, and phrases. Another is the lively conversation among people. The actress Anna Urbanova, he continually describes as a willowy beauty. Young Nina exercises amazing patience with Count Rossoff as he answers her questions about how a princess thinks, acts, and moves her body, something that the young Nina wants to know all about and knows that Count Rossoff knows about. The sous chef is described as delicately deboning pigeons with a whistle on his lips. The pastry chef, in contrast, seems as dusted with flour as one of his rolls. In the Kindle edition of the book, every word in the 40 titles of chapters and subsections starts with the letter A. So this begins with an ambassador, an Anglican ashore, an appointment, and an acquaintanceship. And it goes all the way through the 42 titles to the afterword, the afterwards, and anon at the end. So it's absolutely fascinating how he plays with words. So I highly recommend this delightful book that is not showing up on my screen because of the background I put in. Can you see it?
No, it's your virtual background is doing it. I do know there is one hand raised, and so Rosemary McGee.
Uh-huh.
I agree with Vernon. I read that book a few years ago, and I thought it was one of the best books that I had read in a very long time. I want to share very quickly just a couple things about the author. One is that his career was spent for the most part as an investment banker, and he retired from that, I think probably late 40s, early 50s, and that's when he began to write fiction. I think he has one other novel. But there's a very interesting
Civility. It's called Civility.
Civility. There's a very interesting anecdote that I read about him, which actually says that when he was 10 years old, he threw a bottle with a message inside into the Atlantic Ocean. Several weeks later, he received a letter from Harrison Salisbury, who was then the managing editor of the New York Times. Towles and Salisbury corresponded for many years afterwards. So I just thought that was a fascinating tale that I'm sure had a major influence in his life, one would think.
Yes, I'm sorry. The actual title of that first one is Rules of Civility. So here you would see Towles using those kinds of procedures he did with young Nina when she said, well, what is a princess like? Well, how does she eat? How does she think? How does she walk? And so now in this first book, he's giving the rules of civility. So if any of you want to be civil, you could find out how to act from Amor Towles.
Okay, thank you, Vernon.